I live in rural Wisconsin. Surrounded by corn, marsh, the works. I remember I was in my teens, outside at dusk with my parents, but we were all doing our own thing. Suddenly a woman's voice yells, "Help me," from the woods beside our house. Just loud enough to hear, but quiet enough for me to second guess what I heard. My mom and dad both turned to look at me like, "You heard that too, right?" Mom starts screaming, "Do you need help? Where are you?" It's moved from dusk to pitch black now and the hair stood up on my neck because it got too quiet. Mom wanted to keep yelling, but Dad just got up from his chair and said, "Inside." I think that's one of the only times I've seen her listen to him. Edit. This is a horribly violent incident, read at your own risk. Not seen or experienced. I was at my village 6 or something months back. I don't live there, so I don't know anybody other than a couple houses next to mine. One afternoon, we were supposed to clean the rice. It was a relative's wedding and we had to supply for the food to be cooked ourselves, and I was helping too. I understand the local dialect, though I can't speak it well enough. There were aunts/grandmas/sisters and all the women available. They started gossiping about an incident happening in the house next to theirs. The incident was a young girl about 20, was so brutally beat up by her own brother, in front of the crowd of folks. Not by hand, not by stick, but a giant-ass frame of a bed and something metal. Then he had pinned her to the ground in a chokehold until she was unconscious. Her mother was there were men, there were adults. Nobody did anything. She was later admitted in the hospital with broken ribs and a couple more severe injuries. All because she answered to her brother rudely, not exactly rude but kind of back-answered, or I think she said no to something he had demanded, I'm not sure. People didn't do anything, just watched the whole show, and excused the fucking monster, saying he was probably possessed or he is not like that. I had heard about this incident 2 days after this happened. When I talked to my grandma about it, or asked her to file a complaint, she said, "That is not our matter. We don't poke our noses in someone else's houses, no matter how criminally offensive that is." That was the most shocking thing I have heard. I used to live in the desert for a year, and on nights when the moon isn't out or there are clouds blocking out the stars and moon, it's almost pitch black. You can't see more than 10 yards ahead of you. One night I was driving down the highway going home, and then suddenly in my headlights I see a guy running on the side of the highway full on sprinting. I'm going 70 miles per hour, so it's only for a second or two, but I'm like, what the hell was he running from? I hope he's okay because I'm not pulling over Lamau. But then maybe a minute later I see another guy in my headlights, only he's walking on the side of the highway, and I swear to God it looked like the same guy, two separate guys in the dark walking/running on the side of the highway. What possible reason could explain that? I didn't see any cars on the side of the road that might have broken down. I was so weirded out I just had an uncomfortable feeling the entire ride home. My uncle used live way out in the country on a plot he said was a little less than 8 acres. His closest neighbors weren't terribly far away, within quick driving distance, but also just far enough that walking wasn't very viable. Anyways, I spent my 8th grade summer there, and he had one story that scared the shit out of me back then. He had an array of animals on the farm, 3 hunting dogs, pigeons, dozens of chickens, other various birds, a few goats and a lone horse, and every night he would make his rounds through his farm just to make sure everybody was where they were supposed to be and that everything was locked up. One night as he's walking back to his house, his dogs start going wild. He initially doesn't give care to it and continues on his way, but his dogs are just relentlessly barking. He points his flashlight around and doesn't see anything. He gets to the back door of his house, his dog's still barking, and so he turns around one last time. Way out in his fields he says he does see what looks like a moving shadow. He automatically assumes it's a coyote or some other wild animal and just goes inside. The next night as he goes out to make his rounds, he said he was immediately stopped as he spotted some sort of shadowy figure just a little distance away from his barn. He didn't say anything, but he did take out his gun. Again, his initial thought was maybe a coyote trying to get his chickens. However, as he took a few steps, he said the figure suddenly stood up, almost human-like, and ran into the field, covered in darkness. He said he was so startled he just froze for a moment before yelling out, "Hey!" He didn't give chase to whatever or whoever it was. He did say that for about a week after, his dogs would go ballistic at night, but he never saw the figure again. When he was telling me the story, he said that it probably could have just been a transient, but I don't know. The dude lived in the middle of nowhere and had to drive like 40 minutes to shop. Seems incredibly bizarre for some random homeless to even be in that area. He said it could have also been a black bear, but I don't know either. He wasn't even close to the kind of area I would think black bears inhabit. Dude lived in a rural country farming area, not anywhere remotely close to mountains, forests, etc. Australia has a reputation for scary animals, but people don't ever talk about the sounds you hear. The cutest, most fluffy, sweet-faced little animals make demon noises in the dark. Our birds scream, possums sound horror movie noises, koalas sound like giant monsters. All of these are completely harmless. Generally, the dangerous animals are, coincidentally, the ones you can't hear. I showed up at a friend's house once, as I did almost every day after school, like 13 years old. I rode my bike everywhere. I usually left it by the side of her pool in her backyard, but as I'm pulling up she starts waving at me from her front porch. Her parents had gotten upset with us for leaving our bikes up there before, but neither of their cars is in the driveway, so I cruise up and we head inside. She immediately locks the door and calls 911. She had been up in her room looking for me to arrive, as she usually did apparently, and spotted a man lurking behind their pool, very near where I usually dropped my bike. I was almost kidnapped or like anything, I don't know. The guy booked it when the cops arrived and they didn't find him. I live in a fairly rural part of NJ surrounded by forest and hills. One night in high school my friends and I were driving down one of the local back roads to find a place to chill and smoke. As we're driving, a deer jumps out in front of the car, as they normally do. This time though, as we slowed down, the deer turned around back the way it came, walked up to a tree, and then proceeded to bash its head in on the tree in one hit and fall dead. It didn't run into the tree, it walked over and then slammed its head into it. It was the weirdest behavior we've ever seen. Could have been rabies, but was really freaky. Unsettled all of us, and we decided to go back and smoke at my friend's house. Also, fox screams. Holy hell, does it sound like murder. I was in northern Wisconsin with my family as a kid. While I was up there I went on a little hike with my brother and dad, just sorta going through some woods. Ended up emerging from them onto someone's property, and the dude there saw us, came up with his kid and asked the obvious, "What you doing on my property?" My dad just apologized and said we were hiking and that he shouldn't have been so careless. We went back quickly, and while the encounter was odd, it didn't feel tense or anything. My brother and I also learned a good lesson about respecting private property. However, dude we encountered was apparently not satisfied. I get it to some degree. If I lived outside an urban area I'd be sus too if someone emerges from the forest onto my property. Things got weird though. The guy we encountered actually got some goon who either worked for or was related to him to track us back to our cabin. About 5 minutes after we got back and started to make lunch, this goon literally waltzes inside the cabin and begins to talk about how we were caught trespassing. He wasn't yelling or angry or anything, but it was still pretty jarring having some camo wearing guy that you've never seen before to just barge into your grandparents' house. He didn't have a lot of time to say much because our grandparents owned a few guns, mostly antiques though, and sure enough one got pulled on him. Our grandma held this guy up, and actually apologized again for the prior instance of trespassing. Then she started to yell at him though for following us, trespassing on our property, and straight up coming inside uninvited, and then he left. Was a really weird encounter. Have talked to my dad and brother about it on occasion though, so it wasn't a dream or my imagination. Either way, don't trespass. That's the lesson I learned. Edit, a lot of people are speculating that we stumbled on drugs or something, and to be honest I find that unlikely. The guy that talked to my dad gave his name, I certainly don't remember it though, and again had his own son with him. I think it's more likely we pissed off someone who values property and privacy and they overreacted greatly. Regardless, as others have noted, if you find yourself in a similar situation, remain polite, apologize, and GTFO. Live out in the country. Realized one night that we never got the mail that day, so I walked out to the road to get it. No moon that night, so it was pitch black, just the sound of crickets and tree frogs. As I'm walking back up the driveway, I hear my husband whistling. From the direction it's coming from, it seems he walked out the back door and was coming around the side of the house towards me. I didn't know why and didn't bother to ask. I just went up on the porch and back in the front door. Just then my husband came out of the bathroom. I still get freaked out a little when I think about it. It was 100% a human whistling a tune, and both humans were in the house. When I was a child, 2 of my friends and I decided to explore around an abandoned house that was down the road from us. Typical abandoned house look, paint peeling off everywhere with exposed wood in some spots, plants/vines overgrown, broken windows, roof tiles missing here and there. Well, we walked inside and it matched the outside, cupboards broken, floorboards splintered and cracked. Other than the place being extremely empty, we didn't really get any scary vibes from it. Nothing really stood out to us as paranormal as we'd expect. So we leave the house mildly disappointed. We're walking alongside of one of the windows when this very well-dressed, well-groomed man, maybe in his 60s, wearing a black dress coat, white shirt and black tie, comes into view. We didn't see him inside, never heard anything. Yet here was this man just staring at us blankly through the window. Friends and I booked it as fast as we ever ran out of there and back home. It probably was just one of the property owners that just happened to be inside the same day we were. There were a few rooms we didn't go in, but good God, that scared the shit out of us, lol. A few years later, the local fire department burnt the place down in a controlled burn, so if it was paranormal, Velp, it's gone now, lol. Grew up spending a ton of time in the Colorado Rockies. In college, a friend and I were on a weekend backpacking trip up in National Forest land, about 300 yards off trail, when we stumbled across a mostly buried bunker someone had made. Think a 20-foot long tough shed, buried up to its roof. We only noticed it because sun glinted off one of two small windows in the roof, which had been deliberately covered with brush/tree litter. Looking through the windows, we could make out a cot, buckets and tubs of food and supplies, etc. Found the door, concealed/partially buried, which had a heavy padlock securing it. Noped out of there with a quickness, didn't want to run into whoever had built the place. I used to live 30 minutes away from where I am now in the Philippines, and back then there weren't any convenience stores or supermarkets nearby in my village. It was just all grass, trees, and vines, perfect if you want to hide mutilated or sacked bodies. One day, my parents and I drove home from my preschool. Suddenly my dad went silent and told me not to look. I was stupid enough to disobey, and saw someone hanging from the trees with their neck. We learned later on that people were killing themselves because of destitution and personal conflict. So I live in the city, but I'd call myself quite an accomplished outdoorsman when I can get away from the city life. A few years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles, 8,500 kilometers, around the US. At night, I most often preferred to wild camp, simply finding somewhere to disappear into the woods, somewhere people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. It ended up being one of my favorite parts of the whole trip, just finding some secluded spot in the woods to get some much needed rest. But the forest, I quickly learned, is not a quiet place at night. There's always some form of noise. The chirping of thousands of crickets becomes a constant drone throughout the night, accompanied by many toads. There would always be at least a slight breeze through the trees, or the babbling of a nearby creek. It was always a highlight of my nights, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the distant yips and howls of coyotes, and I fondly look back on the one night where two owls, one on either end of my tent, called back and forth through much of the night. After a month or so of this, I became quite accustomed to the nighttime sounds of the forest, and it became very comforting. So it was quite a shock to my system when one night in rural Montana, I realized I was struggling to sleep because of the exact opposite of what keeps most people up. That night, it wasn't the noise that was keeping me awake, but rather the complete lack of any noise. It was dead silent. And that was an incredibly unnerving experience. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever heard. It almost felt as if the entire forest was hiding from an equally silent predator. Suddenly the occasional snapping of a twig, a common sound that would normally get lost in the cacophony of the forest, sounded like a gunshot. I slept terribly that night, and morning could not come soon enough. My family lives in an old farmhouse, surrounded by a lake, field and forest. No neighbors nearby. No reason for outsiders being near, it's a dead-end road. This happened to my aunt when she was dog sitting. She wakes up in the middle of the night to some noises. Our dog was less than helpful guard dog and she didn't alert her at all. Aunt sees several people outside with flashlights, walking around the yard. She panics and immediately puts on all the lights and the people escape. She called the cops, but it would have taken them an hour to get there. Nothing was taken, but sure scared the hell out of my aunt. Honestly, people are always scarier to find in the woods than animals. Animals are supposed to be there, people usually not, and if they are, they're up to something likely to be dangerous or illegal. I grew up in rural-ish Illinois, but when I was 16 was house sitting for my aunt and uncle in the middle of nowhere Illinois, about an hour and a half away from anyone I knew. Which was dumb of me because I was such an anxious kid, but they were paying me $300. I had all of the blinds and curtains tightly closed so I wasn't creeped out by the desolate location, corn, as far as the eye could see. Around dusk I was nearly positive I heard the back door jiggle, but convinced myself I had imagined it. I was popping popcorn, so I blamed it on that. An hour or so later I heard very distinct whimpering outside. At first I thought it was one of their cats, but then I realized it was more human, childlike. I started peeking through blinds and didn't see anything. At that point I called my dad to try and get him to come out and stay with me. When I accepted the gig he warned me that he wouldn't come to my rescue when I got too scared. So he told me I was psyching myself out and that I was safe. It wasn't long, though, before the whimpers turned into actual human cries, and to me it sounded like a little kid. I put on my brave pants and opened the sliding glass door blinds to see that a girl was lying on the patio furniture crying. I quickly unlocked the door and flung it open, but as soon as she heard me she jumped up and started banshee screaming while looking me dead in the eye. It turned out that she wasn't a girl, it was a grown, but petite, woman, maybe in her 50s, just staring at me and screaming at the top of her lungs. Obviously I slammed the door shut again and locked it and sprinted into the kitchen to call the cops. This was before teenagers had cell phones, so I was relying on the landline. During that call she began violently banging on the sliding glass door. I decided to hide in a lower kitchen cabinet, lol, dumb hiding spot, in case she got in. It was going to be a bit of a wait because the police station was about 30-ish minutes out. I had about a million anxiety attacks in that time, but after a few minutes the banging had stopped and it was dead quiet. I also called my dad back and had him on the line while he drove. He was an early adopter of the cell phone, thank goodness, because the 911 operator said they couldn't let me tie up their lines and stay on the call with them until the cops arrived. A very lazy, disinterested police officer finally showed up, did a 5-minute sweep of the property before saying there was no threat. Mind you, this was a massive farm operation with half a dozen outbuildings, a few sheds, acres of corn, and endless opportunities to hide. And this man took a single lap around the house, half-heartedly pointing his flashlight around. Luckily he did agree to stay with me until my dad arrived. My dad showed up and told me to go to sleep, and he sat on the patio with a shotgun until sunrise. The next day my dad and I, and his shotgun, poked around the property and found evidence that someone had been staying in a storage shed, but no sign of the woman. And there was no sign of the woman ever again after that. If it weren't for her little hidey hole in the shed, I almost feel like people would have thought I imagined it. This experience actually caused a huge falling out between my dad and his sister, because she said she needed me there as a house sitter to feed the cats and keep an eye on the chickens, but it later came out that they had a feeling that somebody had been nosing around their home and that's why they wanted a house sitter. They never found the woman, there was zero evidence that she was doing drugs on the property. That was our initial assumption and she could have been, just nothing to point to that in the shed. She was about 4 miles from the nearest home and 30 miles from town, aka a gas station, grocery store, and church, so they were unsure how she even got there in the first place. She absolutely terrified me, and I had literal trauma afterwards and couldn't be alone, but I feel horrible for her because I can't begin to imagine the circumstances that led her to that night, and I worry about where she went afterward. Okay, this is awful, so trigger warnings. Edit, kidnapping/child sexual abuse/rape. Sorry I didn't put specifics before. It's my first trigger warning, or whatever. It's also a bit long, but that's because there's a lot to this. I still can't believe it all happened. From about age 8 to 11, my family lived in the woods, up in Northern California. We were hippies, sort of, combo hippie/rednecks. Also, I'm oldish, so when I was a kid, there was no cell phones or internet. There was no cable and we had no TV, or electricity for that matter. Kids would just hang out, for fun, and since this was the 70s, we were mostly unsupervised. One of the kids in the group I hung out with was a kid I knew as Dennis. He was a year older than me, and I liked him. I had my first tiny crush on him, actually. Goofy, quiet but fun, interesting. He taught me to ride a dirt bike, and we used to go cruising around together, me on the back. One day we were riding around, and Dennis said he had to swing by his place to get something. I'd never been to his house, but my brother had, and he came back with stories about Dennis' dad being really creepy, in a sexual way. He liked when Dennis brought his male friends over, but hated when girls came along. He'd give the boys pot and beer, and show them porn. My brother was freaked out and didn't go there again. On this day, Dennis made me wait outside. He said Ken would be really angry if I came in. At the time, they lived in a trailer, sort of, in the middle of nowhere up a dirt road, with a tall wire fence, and a dog in the yard outside that barked at me non-stop as I waited for Dennis. Ken stood at the window and stared at me with an angry, pouty look on his face. It was weird as hell. Dennis eventually came back out, and we left. I tried talking to Dennis about his dad, but he shut down and would not discuss it at all. When I turned 12, we moved, and I lost touch with Dennis. Then, when I was 14 or 15, my mom sat my brother and I down and said she had something to tell us. She said that the kid we knew as Dennis was actually named Steven. That the man we thought was his father, Ken, had kidnapped Dennis when he was only 7 years old. He'd told Dennis that his parents didn't want him anymore, and had given him to Ken to raise. Dennis was heartbroken, but believed it after a while, because what else could he do? He was only 7. Ken molested Dennis for 7 years. He raped him, and this is a quote from Ken himself, thousands of times. I can't even think about it. It makes me so fucking angry. My friend lived in that hell, the prisoner of a sadistic child rapist. When Dennis was about 14 or so, he was getting too old to be sexually interesting to that psychopath Ken anymore. So Ken went out and kidnapped another little boy, and brought him home. He dyed the kid's hair, and told Stephen this was his new brother. The kid's name was Timmy White. Ken left Timmy with Stephen, and went to work one evening. Stephen realized that this is what Ken had done to him, that his parents hadn't given him away, that Ken had kidnapped him, just as he did Timmy. He wanted to spare Timmy from the rape he knew was coming, so he took Timmy and managed to hitchhike/walk about 35 miles to the nearest sheriff station in Ukiah. He walked Timmy in and then Stephen left, figuring he had nowhere else to go, but a cop saw him, brought him in and talked to him. He said, "I know my first name is Stephen." And Ken was arrested. Stephen saved Timmy and was a hero, and an amazing person. Ken spent less time in prison than he'd held Stephen for, because the prosecutor didn't bring rape charges, to spare Stephen from having to testify about it. That always pissed me off. Ken spent so little time in prison, and he was a dangerous fucking monster. He did, eventually, try to buy a little boy from his Meals on Wheels caretaker. She went to the police, wore a wire, and Ken was finally thrown in prison for life, where he belonged. He's now dead, and I was fucking thrilled the day he died. The very weird postscript to this, is that years later, when I was in my 30s, Stephen's older brother, Kerry, was arrested for the serial killings of 4 people, 2 women, 2 teenage girls. You may know about that case if you're into true crime. I still can't get my head around the fact that these things happened in one family. And that none of us had a clue what was happening to Stephen, back when we all hung out. Edit. Fuck. I just looked up some news stories, to check that I got details right about time/ages and stuff. And I found out that when Ken kidnapped Timmy White, he paid a local kid with money and pot, to help him. And the kid did it. He helped Ken kidnap Timmy. And that kid lived in a trailer on our fucking property for a while, and I knew him. His name was Sean Poorman. He did some messed up stuff to me when I was maybe 10, which I won't get into. He lived there because my mom was always taking in stray/troubled people, and offered him the trailer for a while. Fucking hell.